I think the natural starting place for thinking about the value of information and knowledge, especially for a business strategist, would seem to be that we would talk about knowledge and information having a market value, right? That intellectual property is something that somebody creates and therefore should be able to get the benefits of it in the marketplace. That's how a business strategist, I think, is supposed to start the answer. But the reality is my starting point is a little bit different. I like the notion that knowledge has intrinsic value. I think people get into scholarship as a faculty member studying, whether they study poetry or chemistry or business strategy. They do that to understand it deep down because they believe that it has value in and of itself. It's intrinsic. And I think, to me, academic responsibility flows not out of considerations that I have in the back of my head that I might be depriving somebody of their property, but just because I love knowledge and learning so much, and that's why I pursue it. And it would be anathema for me to consider being irresponsible in sourcing and plagiarizing. If you love painting, it would be silly to cut and paste something off of the internet and try to use that and pass it off as your own. No great painter would ever do that. And just in that same way, I would say people who are committed to the intrinsic value of learning, who love learning for learning's sake, would just find it anathema to actually want to borrow somebody else's ideas and call them their own. Why would you do that? So I grew up in a working class neighborhood, mainly of shell fishermen, and I went to the public library. And that's where I got my start as a scholar, as somebody who was interested in the world. Every piece of information I had was whatever I could get at a public library. And public libraries, in a lot of ways, exist in our democracy to eliminate, to the degree that you can, the privilege that comes from a sort of privileged access to information based on class or race or ethnicity or background. As I've grown as a scholar and as I've entered the marketplace for academic ideas and as I've worked in the business world, I've seen that the information I had access to in that public library was nothing. It paled in comparison to the types of information that companies have at their disposal, the types of information that scholars have at their disposal, the tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars we spend on databases to give faculty and students at a university access to information. It's an enormous privilege that we have, but that puts a responsibility on us to remember that there are people who are still trying to get information through public access, that there still are people who are trying to make good decisions as citizens or investors or as thinkers engaged in our society or as parents on the safety of products based only on what they have access to in terms of information in their public library or in the free or on the internet. So I think it puts a really heavy responsibility on us to think about information privilege and the effects that it has and the ways that we can circumvent it. The difference between a producer and a consumer of knowledge is one click. When you're online and you're consuming a blog post, for example, or you're reading a website or a news story on a news source, and you decide to respond with a comment and click, suddenly you go from being a consumer to a producer. We've spent a lot of time in our lives thinking about the difference in the days when print media was difficult to do. Right? When publishing a book or getting published in a newspaper or publishing a letter to the editor in a magazine, there was a huge difference between being a producer of knowledge and a consumer. And sometimes I think it's really helpful for students to remember back to those days, to see that there is a difference between the responsibilities that are placed on somebody who's simply reading information and consuming that information and somebody who's contributing to the marketplace of ideas. I think students increasingly, because universities recognize undergraduate research in particular as a really vital part of the transformational process that education entails these days. Students enter into the scholarly conversation and into the community much earlier these days. And so an idea put forth during a summer research project with a faculty member can very much become part of the scholarly conversation, and therefore it puts the student into that role perhaps earlier than they might have expected to.